There is a political firestorm absolutely raging in California right now, and it's all centered on one single jaw-dropping number. We're talking about an accusation of fraud so huge, $250 billion, that it could literally change everything about the state's politics and its finances. $250 billion. Just let that sink in for the second. That is the staggering amount that a Republican challenger is claiming is being wasted, squandered, and defrauded by California's current Democratic administration. And as you can imagine, this single number has kicked off an all-out political war. So what is really going on here? I mean, is this just a calculated political attack, a hit job in an election year? Or is it a legitimate warning sign that there's a real crisis in how California is managing its money? That's the big question we're going to unpack. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at where this massive number even came from. Then, we're going to dive into the actual report making these claims, and of course, hear the governor's pretty fiery response. After that, we'll see how this whole thing went national, and finally, we'll figure out where this high-stakes standoff is headed. So, let's get right to it. Where in the world did a number this big even come from? Well, it didn't come from some official state audit. It came from a political opponent of the current governor. So, this battle has two very clear sides. On one side, you have the accuser, Republican gubernatorial candidate Steve Hilton, and on the other, the defendant, Governor Gavin Newsom's administration. Hilton is the one making the charge, and his target is squarely on how the state is handling your taxpayer money. The whole basis for this claim comes from a website Hilton started called Califraudia.com. It was basically an open call for anonymous tips from whistleblowers. And according to Hilton, they got so many replies that they were able to start, in his words, painting a picture of the scale of this, which he alleges is just massive, systemic fraud. All right, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty. What's actually in this report he's calling Califraudia? I mean, where does he claim all this money is being lost? Well, it points to some really specific and key areas of the state government. The report touches on pretty much everything. We're talking about public pension and retirement systems, inflated government contracts, and even pay abuse in the K-12 school system. It also rolls in the $55 billion in unemployment losses, which has been pretty well documented, and alleges major fraud and programs for housing and homelessness. Okay, to give you a really concrete example of what's being alleged here, let's look at something called pension spiking. Here's how it works. A government employee's pay gets artificially jacked up right before they're about to retire. Why? Well, the goal is to lock in a way bigger pension for the rest of their life, a payout that's not actually based on what they earned over their whole career. Hilton says this is just one of many ways the system is being gamed. So you might be asking yourself, why such a huge number and why right now? Well, Hilton's theory is that all that emergency government spending during the pandemic didn't just go away. He's arguing that it got, quote, baked into the regular state budget, which he believes has created the perfect environment for an absolute explosion in waste and fraud over the last 5 years. Okay, so you can probably guess that Governor Newsom's office was not just going to sit back and take these allegations. Their response was fast, it was sharp, and believe it or not, it came with its own massive number. The administration's first move was to just dismiss the report outright. A spokeswoman for Newsom basically said, "Who is Steve Hilton?" and that they don't respond to MAGA made-up numbers. It was a clear attempt to frame the whole thing as a politically motivated attack with zero credibility. But they didn't just deny the charge. No, they came back with their own giant figure, $125 billion. And this number, well, it tells a completely different story. So this is a total flip of the script. The Newsom administration is arguing that the real story here isn't about the state losing money to fraud. They say it's about the state aggressively fighting fraud. Their claim is that they've actively blocked over $125 billion in bogus claims, basically positioning the governor as a watchdog, protecting taxpayer money, not losing it. Now, you know a story's getting serious when it goes from a state issue to a national headline. And man, this one did not stay in California for long. It escalated, and it escalated fast. I mean, look at how quickly this all went down. On January 4th, Hilton officially asks for a federal investigation. Just a few days later, President Trump announces a federal probe into California. And almost immediately after that, Newsom's office is on social media firing back at Trump. This became a federal issue in a matter of days. And Hilton's request to the Attorney General wasn't some vague letter. He was asking for the whole shebang, a full-scale federal investigation, the deployment of specialized FBI units to California, and a complete audit of every single federal dollar being spent in the state. So, after all that, where does it leave us? Well, with accusations flying back and forth and the federal government now involved, we're basically watching a high-stakes political standoff that is nowhere near being resolved. So let's just boil it all down. On one side, you have Steve Hilton and the GOP, alleging over $250 billion in systemic fraud. On the other side, you have Governor Newsom and the Democrats dismissing it all as politics and claiming they've actually blocked $125 billion in fraud. You've got two completely opposite stories, each built around a gigantic number. And here's the key thing to remember. This is just the beginning. A federal probe has been announced, both sides are digging their heels in, and we are absolutely watching the opening shots of what's going to be a long, intense political and maybe even legal battle for California. All of this leaves us with one fundamental question, right? When you've got political rivals throwing these billion-dollar figures at each other, who's actually responsible for digging through the noise and finding the real truth for all the taxpayers caught in the middle?